Good day. So for this lecture, we're going to talk about hemostasis. Let us start off with some terms. The first term is hemostasis, the topic for today. This is a process by which the integrity of the blood vessels is maintained. Right, so normally the blood is in liquid state inside the blood vessels. However, during a vascular injury, there will be a formation of blood clot in order to prevent the bleeding. The second term is thrombosis. So this is a pathologic condition wherein there is the presence of a blood clot, which is also called thrombus, in the circulation. Right? Both hemostasis and thrombosis share some components, 5 components. One, platelets. Both of them make use of platelets. Secondly, the part that is affected is normally the blood vessel wall or the endothelium. Third is the coagulation system. So this is activated during the process. Then the regulatory system for the coagulation. And then finally, we have the fibrinolytic system, so which is the process by which the clot is dissolved in the processes of hemostasis and thrombosis. For hemostasis to be successful, there are certain processes that happen. For example, there will be vasoconstriction, so the blood vessels will become smaller, and that's because of the activation of the smooth muscles. And then the platelets will be activated, becoming sticky in the process, and that will be the start of the formation of a blood clot. And then thirdly, the enzymes that are involved, called coagulation factors, will be activated in order to form fibrin. Okay, this coagulation system is a complex process. It needs only a very simple stimulus. For example, if there is a cut in the skin, okay, it will stimulate the formation of the activation of the blood factors, clotting factors. And we can say that this can actually be a life-saving process or event because bleeding, if it's not stopped, can lead to blood loss. And if you lose more than 20% of your blood volume, that can be very dangerous. It can lead to shock, hypovolemic shock. Right? So the key elements of this process called hemostasis are the cells of the vascular intima, so that means the endothelial cells, and then the extravascular tissue factor bearing cells, and then thirdly the platelets. So these three elements, the cellular elements, are very much involved in the process of hemostasis. There are also plasma components. We already mentioned the clotting factors, coagulation factors, and also the fibrinolytic proteins, and also their inhibitors. So all of these would be interacting, and it will depend on the um, how these substances are activated or inhibited. Right, so hemostasis is categorized into two. It can be primary or secondary. When we say primary hemostasis, this is when the blood vessels and platelets respond to an injury, vascular injury. Right, and then when we say secondary hemostasis, this is when the coagulation factors are activated to form a fibrin clot. So in short, primary hemostasis involves the blood vessels and the platelets, and then secondary hemostasis is the second step, which is the subsequent step, which is the activation of the coagulation factors. Okay, so this table would further show us the difference between primary and secondary hemostasis. We can see how they are activated So simple injuries, small injuries lead to primary hemostasis. If it's larger, involving the blood vessels, large blood vessels and surrounding tissues, then that would stimulate the activation of the secondary hemostasis. For primary hemostasis, it is mainly the blood vessels plus the platelets. It is rapid acting but short-lived. Okay, and the procoagulant substances exposed or released by the damage or activated endothelial cells are the um, substances that stimulate this process. Right, for secondary hemostasis, this also involves the platelets plus the coagulation factors. This is somehow delayed and long-term. And the one that is activating this process is called the tissue factor. Right, so let's talk about the platelets. We know that platelets are involved in both primary and secondary hemostasis. Platelets are the smallest blood cells and they are produced from the bone marrow. They are fragments of the biggest, the giant cells in the bone marrow we call megakaryocytes. So the normal platelet count ranges from 150 to 400. Of course, in some references, it may be 150 to 300. Right? The normal lifespan is about 8 to 10 days. So like they last in the circulation for about 8 to 10. The morphology of platelets, how do they look like? Under light microscope, we can see that platelets are very small. They are rounded cells. They don't have a nucleus. Their size is only about 1/5 of that of the red blood cell, and they are possessed with reddish-purple granules. Using electron microscope, it further reveals that aside from the cytoplasmic granules, they also have glycoprotein receptors and a contractile cytoskeleton. These glycoprotein receptors, as I said, is found in the cell surface, and this is important in the binding of the platelets to itself. Right. So there are two types: GP glycoprotein 2B 3A to 3A, and glycoprotein 1B dash IX. Right, so the second one is a receptor for what we call VWF or von Willebrand factor, von Willebrand factor in the platelets. Right, so we can see here what I just mentioned. So those are the receptors on the surface, GP2B3A, GP1B-IX. And then the granules, the two types of granules, are categorized into alpha and alpha granules and the dense bodies. The dense bodies are contain the following: ADP, ATP, serotonin, and calcium. For the alpha granules, there are three groups of substances. For example, the adhesive proteins like fibrinogen, von Willebrand factor, fibronectin, and thrombospondin. There are also growth factors, BDGF, TGF-beta, fibronectin, platelet factor 4, and thrombospondin, and lastly, the coagulation factors like fibrinogen, factor 5, factor 9. Right, so we have mentioned this already. Right, so the third important component that is found in the platelets are the cytoskeleton. They are contractile, and the function of this is to maintain the disk of the shape of the platelets. Right, so this is a more or less a summary table for the substances that are found in the granules of the platelets. the alpha granules, which are release large molecules, and the dense granules, which release small molecules. Right. So what about the role of the platelets in hemostasis? Right. So they form the primary hemostatic plug. So it's a plug that prevents further bleeding. And then they release platelet activating and procoagulant molecules. And then thirdly, they provide a procoagulant surface, so that will allow for activation of the coagulation system. Right? So these would be the specific functions of the platelets. One is adhesion, second is aggregation, and thirdly, secretion. Adhesion, that is when the platelets roll and cling to non-platelet surfaces, and adhesion. So aggregation, when platelets adhere to each other, and then thirdly, secretion, when there is the substance being released from the platelets. Characteristics: adhesion is reversible. Its function is to seal the gaps between the endothelial cells, and some of them may release secretion of growth factors. In arterioles, this VWF, one of the substances released, is important for adhesion. The aggregation process is irreversible, and platelet plugs are formed in this stage. Platelet contents are secreted, and this normally requires fibrinogen. The third process is also irreversible and occurs during aggregation of the platelets. Right, so this illustration would show us the steps that we have mentioned. So this is inside the blood vessel. Okay, the pink EC, that would mean endothelial cells, and then of course PLT, platelet, WBC, red blood cells. Right, so outside the blood vessels would be the connective tissue, and in the connective tissue we have fibers like collagen cells, like fibroblasts. Okay, and this is when there is an injury, the platelets are exposed to collagen that's outside the blood vessel, and von Willebrand's factor. Right, so what will happen? So the first stage would be adhesion, right? So the platelets will adhere to the wall of the uh, blood vessel, and then secondly, they will form a aggregates. Okay, they will aggregate to each other. So this is aggregation. Okay, and then thirdly, there will be reinforcement of fibrin because of the activation of the coagulation factor. Right. So in this slide, we can see the structure of the platelet. So the outer part would be the phospholipid bilayer. That's the cell membrane of the platelet. The cell membrane of the platelet contains phospholipid, and in the action of the phospholipase A2, this membrane, okay, phospholipid membrane will be converted into arachidonic acid. In the presence of an enzyme called cyclooxygenase, this arachidonic acid will be converted into prostaglandin, and then another enzyme, thromboxane A synthase, will produce thromboxane A. Thromboxane A has the following functions. It is responsible for the release of calcium and platelet aggregation and vasoconstriction. Right. So, however, if the person would be taking in aspirin, this aspirin can block cyclooxygenase A. Therefore, the arachidonic acid cannot be converted into prostaglandin, and thromboxane A will not be activated. So this will affect the function of the platelets. Okay. Right, so the blood vessel wall is the first line of defense for normal hemostasis. So this is actually what triggers normal hemostasis. It's provided with ECs or endothelial cells, and they can produce von Willebrand's factor. Right, so these von Willebrand factors are secreted directly onto the circulation or in the subendothelium that contains collagen. After there is a damage in the endothelial cells, okay, the platelets will bind to the PWF and the collagen, and this will be the start of hemostasis. This forms a selective membrane, tight selective membrane that prevents blood cells and plasma from escaping the blood vessels. So the endothelial cells are very important in the process of hemostasis. If it is damaged, there will be activation of the platelets and release of coagulation factors and fibrinolysis. However, if it remains intact, there will be no such thing. The innermost part of the blood vessel is called the vascular intima, and it's lined with endothelial cells. And when this is damaged, this will release certain substances that will attract the platelets and activate. So this serves as a non-thrombogenic surface, okay, that maintains the blood in a fluid state. So unless it is damaged, the blood in that part will remain liquid. There are three systems that will limit the coagulation if it's activated. So number one is antithrombin 3, protein C and protein S, and then the third one is tissue factor pathway inhibitor. Right, anyway, we'll be talking about this in another lecture. Right, during injury or during inflammation, the anticoagulant function of the blood vessel is downregulated and it becomes procoagulant. Injury to the endothelial cells activate thrombogenic subendothelial cellular extracellular matrix, or what we call ECM. This will trigger the platelets to be activated and adhere to the surface of the blood vessel wall, and there will also be simultaneous activation of the coagulation factors. Right, so anticoagulant properties of intact endothelium. So I just want to emphasize that while there is no damage in the endothelial wall, this will promote anticoagulation. So it will prevent the activation of the platelets and also the coagulation factor. In short, the blood will remain fluid or liquid. Right, so it's composed of rhomboid cells, the endothelium composed of rhomboid cells, and it secretes platelet inhibitor called prostacyclin. There are many secretions here we can mention. Nitric oxide, which relaxes the blood vessel wall from producing, it prevents it from producing the coagulating factors. And then what else? Heparan sulfate. So we can see more or less it's heparin, so it's a anticoagulant. Tissue factor pathway inhibitor, protein C receptor, thrombomodulin, and TPA or tissue plasminogen activator. One of the things that will happen during injury is that the blood vessels will undergo constriction. So this will make the blood vessels smaller, and the one that triggers this process are called vasoconstrictors. So examples of this would be angiotensin 2 and thromboxane A2. They are produced by cells like the endothelial cells and the platelets respectively. Right. So aside from anticoagulant properties, these blood vessels can also help in the stimulation of coagulation, right? So especially when there is damage. Number one, the smooth muscles in the arterioles and arteries will induce vasoconstriction. Okay, then exposed subendothelial collagen will bind with von Willebrand factor and the platelets. The damaged or activated epithelial cells, endothelial cells will secrete more von Willebrand factor and adhesion molecules. P-selectin, ICAM, intercellular adhesion molecule, PECAMs. Right, so they are adhesion molecules. And then exposed smooth muscles and fibroblasts will cause the tissue factor to be exposed. And then finally, in the endothelial cells during inflammation, also the tissue factor is induced in this process. So all of these will lead to coagulation, stimulation of coagulation. Okay, aside from that, blood cells like erythrocytes, monocytes, lymphocytes also are involved in hemostasis. The role of the erythrocytes is to add bulk and structural integrity to the blood clot, fibrin clot. However, if there is anemia, we know that in anemia sometimes the red blood cells are lacking, so this may lead to bleeding. There is tendency for bleeding. In inflammatory conditions, the monocytes and lymphocytes and also the epithelial cells, endothelial cells of the blood vessel. I keep on saying epithelial cells, but actually endothelial cells are epithelial cells found in the blood vessels. They provide surface-borne tissue factor, and this will trigger coagulation. Um, Leukocytes also have certain substances called membrane integrins and selectins, and they are addition. They bind with addition molecules and help stimulate in the production of cytokines and promote wound healing. The process of hemostasis is very important. However, there should be balance between clotting and bleeding. In this presentation, we talked about the role of the blood vessels, the role of the platelets, and the coagulation factors in general in the process of coagulation. So the purpose is to prevent bleeding, further bleeding. However, this blood clot should not remain in the circulation, otherwise it can lead to thrombosis. Okay, and thrombosis is not really a good thing, right? So it can cause embolism and then later on infarction. And infarction can lead to a death of cells that when there is no blood that is coming to that particular organ. Right, so in the next meeting, we're going to talk about the coagulation system, and I hope you will be reading something about it, the coagulation factors. Thank you.